Canada, the second largest country in the world by land area, has a history that stretches back millennia, long before European explorers arrived on its shores. Its story is one of rich indigenous cultures, European colonization, economic growth, and the eventual creation of a multicultural and modern state. Throughout its development, Canada has carved a unique identity, shaped by its geography, its relationship with Indigenous peoples, and its historical ties to Britain and France. This article provides a comprehensive look at Canada's history, from its ancient beginnings to its role as a 21st-century nation. Pre-colonial Canada, Indigenous peoples and civilizations before European contact, the land we now know as Canada was home to a diverse range of Indigenous peoples, each with their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. Archaeological evidence shows that Indigenous communities have inhabited the region for at least 12,000 years, with some estimates suggesting even earlier human presence. These early peoples were highly adapted to the varied environments of Canada, from the Inuit of the Arctic, who developed advanced hunting techniques for survival in harsh climates, to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Iroquois, whose sophisticated political systems in the Great Lakes region are some of the oldest democracies in the world. In what is now British Columbia, the First Nations peoples of the Pacific Northwest built complex societies based on fishing, particularly salmon. In the prairies, nomadic plains First Nations followed vast herds of bison, which was central to their economy and culture. On the east coast, the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples engaged in hunting, fishing, and gathering, while maintaining complex trade networks with other indigenous groups. Indigenous spirituality and oral traditions were deeply intertwined with the land. Many nations had matriarchal systems of governance, sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, and trade networks that spanned vast distances. European exploration and early colonization, 15th–17th centuries, the first Europeans to reach what is now Canada were likely Norse explorers from Greenland around the year 1000, led by Leif Erikson. They established a settlement at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, but it was abandoned after a short time, and contact with Indigenous peoples was limited. It wasn't until the late 15th century that European exploration of Canada began in earnest. In 1497, John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, reached the coast of Newfoundland, claiming the land for England. His discovery was followed by further exploration by other European powers, notably France. In 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, marking the beginning of France's claims in the region. Cartier's encounters with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians at settlements like Hochelaga, modern-day Montreal, laid the groundwork for France's colonial ambitions. New France and the fur trade, 1600 to 1763, by the early 17th century, the French had established a permanent presence in North America. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City, making it the first permanent European settlement in Canada. This marked the beginning of New France, a vast colony stretching from the Atlantic coast through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River. The economy of New France was largely driven by the fur trade, which involved French traders exchanging European goods for valuable beaver pelts with indigenous peoples. This trade was the foundation of alliances between the French and many indigenous nations, particularly the Huron-Wendat. These alliances, however, also led to conflicts with other indigenous groups, including the Iroquois Confederacy. New France was predominantly Roman Catholic, and Jesuit missionaries played a significant role in the colony's expansion, seeking to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Despite the missionaries' efforts, indigenous peoples maintained much of the traditional spiritual practices. Throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, the French and British competed for dominance in North America. By the mid-18th century, this rivalry culminated in the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, known in North America as the French and Indian War. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ceded almost all of France's North American territories to Britain. British rule and Loyalist migration, 1763 to 1800s. With the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained control of Canada, and the former New France became the colony of Quebec. The British sought to accommodate the French-speaking population by enacting the Quebec Act in 1774, which allowed for the continuation of French civil law and the practice of the Roman Catholic faith. This act was a major concession to the French inhabitants and laid the foundation for the unique bilingual and bicultural nature of Canada. Meanwhile, the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, had a profound impact on Canada. After the war, thousands of Loyalists, American colonists who had remained loyal to the British Crown, migrated to Canada, especially to the Maritime provinces and what would later become Ontario. This influx of English-speaking settlers helped shape the demographic and political landscape of the future nation. The War of 1812 and Canada's defense the early 19th century saw growing tensions between Britain and the newly independent United States. These tensions culminated in the War of 1812, fought between the United States and British forces in North America. The war was largely fought on Canadian soil, with significant battles at places like Queenston Heights and Lundy's Lane. Indigenous peoples played a key role in the conflict, particularly the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who allied with the British to resist American expansion. Although the war ended in a stalemate, it fostered a sense of Canadian identity and pride, as Canadian militias and Indigenous forces had successfully defended their territory. The path to Confederation, 1800 to 1867, the early to mid-19th century was a period of significant political and social change in British North America. The influx of settlers, coupled with economic development, led to demands for greater self-governance. The colonies of Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, and Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec, experienced political unrest, most notably during the rebellions of 1837. The British government responded by sending Lord Durham to investigate the causes of the unrest. His Durham report recommended the unification of Upper and Lower Canada into a single colony, which was enacted in 1841 with the creation of the province of Canada. Durham also advocated for responsible government, a principle that was gradually introduced in the Canadian colonies. By the 1860s, political leaders like John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and George Brown were advocating for a broader union of the British North American colonies. Economic concerns, defense against American expansionism, and the desire for a more efficient government all contributed to the push for Confederation. On July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was created with the passage of the British North America Act. The original provinces were Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. This date is celebrated as Canada Day, marking the birth of the Canadian nation. Expansion and nation building, 1867 to 1900s. After Confederation, Canada embarked on a period of territorial expansion and nation building. In 1870, the vast lands of the Hudson's Bay Company were acquired by the new Canadian government, creating the Northwest Territories. The Manitoba Act of 1870 established Manitoba as a province, following the Red River Rebellion led by Louis Riel, a Métis leader who sought to defend the rights of Indigenous and Métis peoples. Riel's resistance was part of a broader struggle over land, culture, and governance in the expanding Canadian West. He would later lead the Northwest Rebellion of 1885 in Saskatchewan, which ended in defeat and his execution. The rebellions highlighted the tensions between the federal government and Indigenous and Métis communities as Canada expanded westward. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, was a crucial element in linking the country from coast to coast. The railway facilitated the settlement of the prairies, the development of resource industries, and the incorporation of British Columbia into Confederation in 1871. However, the expansion of Canada came at a great cost to Indigenous peoples. The federal government implemented policies of assimilation, including the establishment of residential schools, which sought to eradicate Indigenous cultures and languages. These policies had devastating effects on Indigenous communities, effects that are still being reckoned with today. Canada in the 20th century, war, autonomy, and modernization. Canada's participation in World War I, 1914 to 1918, was a defining moment in its development as an independent nation. More than 600,000 Canadians served in the conflict, with over 60,000 losing their lives. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917 became a symbol of Canadian military achievement and national unity. Canada's contributions to the war effort led to increased demands for autonomy from Britain, culminating in the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which granted Canada full legal independence in most matters. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, Canada again played a significant role, with over 1 million Canadians serving in the military. The war effort contributed to the modernization of Canada's economy and the development of a more active role in global affairs. After the war, Canada became a founding member of the United Nations and NATO, signaling its emergence as a middle power on the world stage. Post-war Canada, multiculturalism and the chart of the post-war period saw significant changes in Canadian society. The 1960s brought about a shift toward multiculturalism, particularly with the adoption of the multiculturalism policy in 1971, which recognized the cultural diversity of the country and the contributions of various ethnic groups to Canadian society. Immigration policies were liberalized, leading to a more diverse population. In 1982, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau oversaw the patriation of the Canadian Constitution, including the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which enshrined fundamental rights and freedoms for all Canadians. The Charter has since become a cornerstone of Canadian law and identity. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have also been marked by efforts to address historical injustices against Indigenous peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 2008, documented the abuses of the residential school system and made recommendations for healing and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Modern Canada, challenges and achievements today. Canada is known for its political stability, economic prosperity, and commitment to multiculturalism and social welfare. However, the country continues to face challenges, including addressing the legacy of colonialism, managing its natural resources in a sustainable way, and navigating its relationship with the United States. Canada's political landscape is dominated by a parliamentary system with a constitutional monarchy. It has a reputation for being a peacekeeper on the international stage and for playing a significant role in global issues such as climate change and human rights. As a nation built on diversity, Canada's identity continues to evolve, shaped by its Indigenous heritage, its colonial past, and its role as a modern, multicultural society. Conclusion: Canada's history is a tapestry woven from the threads of Indigenous cultures, European colonization, and the creation of a diverse and modern state. From its beginnings as a land inhabited by rich and varied Indigenous nations to its current status as a leading nation on the world stage, Canada's story is one of resilience, innovation, and progress. Despite the challenges it faces, Canada remains a beacon of democracy, diversity, and human rights in the global community.